Hi, it's good to see everyone. Sounds to me like this is working? The mic's working. So it's great that we've got a really good crowd, so that's great. My name's Jennifer Simpson. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at MUN, and I'm going to give some very brief comments, welcome comments, and then I'll invite Dr. Korneski to introduce our speaker. First, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. So I'll respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut, and the Innu of Nutassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all of the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. I have come to really appreciate, I often open events like this with this acknowledgement, and I think it's a great thing that we start out thinking about relationships and our role in those relationships, which I think is what this land acknowledgement calls us to do. And I think it also reminds us that we live in a context of a reality of colonialism. It's right here with us. And so this land acknowledgement asks us to be aware of that and to think about how we move within those sets of relationships. I've often commented that the role of a Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences is to do what I call to attend to the practices of living together well. And I think that's also what this land acknowledgement helps us think about. I would say that the work of faculty, staff, and students in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, it matters to how we live and to possibilities for equity and for justice. I think each of us and all of us are enmeshed in a variety of relationships, and in doing the work that we do as faculty, staff, and students, and in the community, we're thinking about how are we going to go about constructing the future we want to inhabit? What's it going to look like? It's a big question. It's a hard question, and it's maybe a difficult one to live with constantly, but I think it's one that our faculty is particularly well suited to consider. And I think it's a topic that our speaker tonight will get into. I know she's been engaging with many of you. Many faculty have given lectures, excuse me, today and tomorrow, I believe. And just briefly, before I turn the stage over to Dr. Korneski to introduce our speaker, I'd first like to say thanks to all of you for making it up the hill. It feels kind of cozy in here, even though it's cold and wintry outside. It feels like we're this cozy group that made it to this great lecture. So thanks for coming. I'll also thank the faculty members who have spoken at various panels, the Harris Center for suggesting this venue for the lecture. Sharon Roseman, Associate Dean Research, has contributed to this. Terry Coles in the faculty, the communication advisor, and Dr. Judith Adler, professor in the Department of Sociology. And I'm sure there are many others who have contributed to the success of this evening. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Korneski.
Okay, so does this pick me up? No. Oh. Down? Yes? Okay. I will have to lean over. So my name is Kurt Korneski. I'm in the Department of History here at Memorial. I'm also the recently appointed director of the Maritime Studies Research Unit. I took over after many excellent years of service by Valerie Burton, who's also here in the audience somewhere. I'm in that capacity. I'm here to have the honor of introducing our speaker for this evening. Before I get to the introduction, though, I have to been asked by the organizers to mention to everybody that this is being live streamed, and so just so you're aware of that fact, that not only the lecture but also the Q&A panel session as well. So if you're more than welcome to ask questions, of course, but make sure you smile for the camera. So our speaker tonight is Helen Rozwadowski, who's a professor of history and maritime studies at the University of Connecticut, where she's worked since 2003. She founded the Maritime Studies program there, serving as its director from 2006 to 2013. Before and since that time, she's held a string of fellowships, including the E. and Mary B. Ritter Fellowship of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. In 2018, she was a fellow of the prestigious Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich. And she's also received grants from the National Endowment of Humanities, the National Science Foundation, and the Smithsonian Institute. Her most recent book, Vast Expanses, A History of the Ocean, was published by Reaction Press in 2018. It sits at the intersection of environmental history and the history of science, and has been widely recognized as a masterful study spanning millennia. She begins with the formation of the oceans themselves and proceeds to explore a wide array of diverse and multidimensional histories of human relationships with the ocean around the world. In this and many of her publications, and many other publications, her richly detailed study draws together the sciences and humanities to place ocean at the center of the focus in planetary and human history where it belongs. It would take far too long here this evening to touch on all of Professor Rozwadowski's many achievements. Suffice it to say, she's made an extraordinary contribution to the field of maritime studies. She's also distinguished herself by bringing her exceptionally rich scholarship to communities outside of the Academy. Her effectiveness in this regard has been recognized with book prizes. For example, she won the Watson Davis and Helen Miles Davis Prize for the best book directed to a wide public for her second book, Fathom in the Ocean, The Discovery and Exploration of the Deep Sea. She's also been awarded generous grants to help promote experiential learning in maritime studies, particularly among undergraduate students. Her work then fits perfectly with the mandate of the Henrietta Harvey Distinguished Lecture Series. We're fortunate to have such an eminent speaker here this evening. I very much look forward to Professor Rozwadowski's lecture, which is entitled Writing Ocean Histories. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rozwadowski.
All right. Thank you very much for the very kind and generous introduction, and thank you. Oops, can you hear me? Is that better? Thank you very much to Judith Adler for inviting me and all of the myriad people that you've worked with to bring me here. It's incredibly much of an honor for me to be here. I am humbled to be following in the footsteps of last year's speaker, Kim Tallbear, who is a scholar whose work is inspirational to me. So it feels a little bit like a scary thing to go after her. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm very excited to be giving a lecture endowed by a woman who is friends with Rudyard Kipling, author of my favorite maritime novel, Captain's Courageous. So and maybe tonight kind of reminds me of some of the scenes in Captain's Courageous with the wind and the rain outside. So, all right. So my talk today is based on my recent book, which is an environmental, cultural, and geopolitical history of the oceans. And what I'm going to do today, rather than summarizing the content of the book, is to talk about why the writing of history of the ocean, but also the reading and the sharing of ocean histories is important. In fact, it may be essential for what I consider to be some of our most important present challenges, which include forging a better relationship between people and oceans, not only for the sake of the ocean, but most especially for our sake. I'm also thrilled that my book has come out in both Korean and simple Chinese. I think ocean histories include, and I've been learning about this in the sessions that I've attended with the MUN faculty and graduate students who've given talks about different cultures at different times, and beginning to understand how different cultures at different times had different relationships with the ocean. I hope that my book will serve as an inspiration and perhaps a model for others to write and tell ocean histories everywhere. That is my goal. We have much to learn about how to be with the ocean, by the ocean, and rely on the ocean. So my talk today has 3 sections. I'm briefly going to talk about what I mean by ocean history. I'm going to talk about why ocean histories are important, why I think they're incredibly important today. And then I'm going to try to give a couple of examples of how I think ocean histories can help us build a better relationship with the ocean. So, before I dive in, I should say that based especially on a previous visit I had to Memorial University, I recognize that Newfoundlanders and people in coastal communities like St. John's that remain, I think, more closely tied to the ocean than people in many other communities. I think people in communities like this know that the ocean has a history and recognize a lot of what I have to say, that the ocean has a past that's tied to people, that people and oceans have been connected for a long time. Ocean history, in short, is either a harder or an easier sell in a place like this, I think. But I still suspect that many of you may not have thought all that much about how important ocean history might be. Okay, so Vast Expanses aims to tell a history of the ocean starting with its natural history, starting with geological time and evolutionary time, but focusing especially on the story of interrelationships between oceans and people, including the depths as well as the surface. That's one of the things I've tried to do in all of my scholarship, is to not pause and kind of stop with the history that takes place on top of the ocean or alongside the ocean, but really also try to engage with how people have interacted with the whole volumetric ocean, its depths, the things in its depths. And I think that ocean history must include geography, must include anthropology, literature, ecology, religion. It's like maritime studies. It's a very deeply interdisciplinary endeavor. And it is clear from the very deep past, going back to hominids before Homo sapiens, that people have exploited the ocean for many, many reasons, starting with, of course, food and transportation, but equally as the focus of myth and culture and self-identity. And I think all of those things are important to acknowledge. Now, new uses of the ocean merged over time: science, communication, submarine warfare, mining, oil drilling, bioprospecting, and I write about some of these things. Alongside these new uses, old uses remain: piracy, naval warfare, shipping, smuggling, whaling, fishing. The ocean has enabled and constrained human activities, but people have also affected oceans, in some cases dramatically and in some cases for a long time. In other words, ocean history is very much a two-way story. So the story that I tell in Vast Expanses weaves together three threads. It is, as the first part of my argument suggests, it is a long story. It is a long story of the human relationship with the sea, and an argument that people have been connected with the sea, and not just with the surface and coasts, but with all of the sea, over the scale of evolutionary time, and extending to the present, and we hope into the future. That part would be good. Far from the ahistorical place it seems, the ocean is profoundly a part of history. That may seem obvious, but in a few minutes I'll show you some quotes that reveal that, at least in Western culture, there is a strong perception of the ocean as a timeless place that is apart from people. Second, I argue that connections between people and oceans, though ancient, have tightened over time and multiplied with globalization and industrialization. This trajectory runs counter to the widespread assumption of the ocean as a timeless place apart from humanity. It is, in fact, more like land. We kind of recognize that our use of land has intensified over time in many regards, but we're not used to thinking about the ocean in that way. So one of the points I want to make about ocean history is that our relationship with the ocean has deepened and become tighter over time. And third, as a historian of science, I want to point out that knowledge about the ocean is created in many ways. It's created not only through work, but also through play. It's created through scientific investigation. It's created through the ambitions that people have for using the ocean's resources. And that knowledge about the ocean has played a central role in mediating the human relationship with the ocean. Knowledge has helped people exploit marine resources, control ocean space, extend or project imperial or national power over oceans, and in general attempt to refashion the sea into a more tractable arena. Knowledge about the ocean has animated and strengthened connections between people and oceans, and writing ocean history, I argue, is going to have to involve attention to questions like, how was knowledge about the ocean produced? Why was knowledge about the ocean produced? And how was that knowledge about the ocean applied? One conclusion I've drawn from my research through writing the book Vast Expanses is that the perception of the ocean as timeless is itself as much a product of history as other cultural, political, or economic changes resulting from the mutual relationship between people and oceans. So when I wrote my book, Fathoming the Ocean, I believed that the ocean had always been considered timeless, at least in Western culture. And here are a couple of quotes that were part of the time period I was studying in this book that show a depiction, a cultural perception of the ocean as a place very untouchable by human actions. And the bottom quote, I won't read the top quote, you can read that yourself, but the bottom quote was a quote by the landscape historian John Stilgoe, whose work I admired quite a lot when I was in graduate school. But I remember reading this sentence in his book Alongshore: "The sea is empty of history, utterly without a past." And I remember thinking, that's wrong. Here's this person whose work I super admired, and somehow I thought, he's got that wrong. So in some ways, that might be the moment I started trying to write ocean history, although I think it took a while for me to articulate what I do as ocean history. So today, I recognize that different cultures over different times have held very divergent perceptions of the ocean based on the intersection of their knowledge of the ocean, their uses of its surface, and their living and non-living resources of the ocean, and their cultural perceptions of the sea. So these images are all from different cultures I wrote about in Vast Expanses, Muslim navigators, Inuit people in 15th century Europe who relied a lot on sea fisheries, people in Japan, people in Portugal, people in Oceania and other places. So that's one of the things I set out to do, and it's something that I really hope other people will join in to do, which is to help me and help us all learn about how different cultures used the ocean, but also understood the ocean and lived with the ocean. Beginning in the 15th century, European maritime powers found routes between all of the world's oceans, and long-standing uses of the ocean for trade, for warfare, and for fishing intensified very dramatically in scale and in scope. Maps and books through the 16th and 17th century reveal a cultural perception of the sea as a site for human activity. Mariners, government officials, and readers understood the ocean as full of wind and weather and currents that challenged navigation. But equally, they understood the sea as a place whose depths hid resources and also hid mysterious and unknown elements. And it was studying this time period that made me realize that even the West did not always perceive the ocean as timeless. They understood the ocean to be connected with these human activities that were happening on them. At least that was the conclusion I drew from the research I did from this period. Now, traditional uses of the ocean, especially fishing, shipping, and the extension of geopolitical power, intensified dramatically in the 20th century, tightening the connections between the ocean and especially Westerners, but others as well. Flowing against these currents, the number of people involved with maritime work declined in the 20th century, and what work remained became increasingly invisible to the general public, as for example, when major shipping ports shifted from urban centers to dedicated industrial zones where they were invisible to the average person. Cultural perception of the sea shifted in response, from viewing the ocean as a workplace to considering it a site for reflection and renewal, a place outside of time offering retreat from the modern and urban world. The fundamental quandary of the sea's apparent timelessness, firmly embraced in the 19th and 20th centuries, makes it difficult for us to comprehend and accept the unfamiliar view of the ocean as a place of dynamic change. The paradox of the human relationship with the ocean is a subset of a larger puzzle of interrelationships between people and nature, which is the subject of what environmental historians have taken on. The environmental historian William Cronin used the example of Chicago and its relationship with its hinterlands to point out the futility of trying to untangle the lasting imprint of human actions from an unrecoverable, if not mythical, first nature, he calls it, that existed before or apart from humans. Another environmental historian, Richard White, has written a history of the Columbia River that identifies it as an organic machine, a system modified by people and embedded with technologies that nevertheless continues to manifest its natural qualities. The ocean is equally second nature, strange as that claim may seem, for a part of the planet so incredibly vast and forbidding. Vast Expanses argues that today's ocean is a human ocean, and that ocean has a history relevant to humanity starting when life evolved in the sea. So that's kind of what ocean history is. So why is it important? To explain that, I'm going to start telling you a little bit about how I came to write Vast Expanses. I told you the little bit about that quote from John Stilgoe in 1994, and I'm going to go back a bit before that and tell you a little something biographical, because I think my approach to writing ocean history is shaped by the lack of knowledge of the actual ocean that I had for much of my life. I grew up on the Great Lakes, not far from Ohio, which is where the cartoon up there is set. I sailed in small boats. I read Moby Dick a lot. But I only saw the ocean once in my whole childhood when I was 11. And I remember running into the ocean, diving into the waves, and standing up and being outraged that there was salt in my mouth, because I grew up on the Great Lakes where there's waves and sand and not salt. So I had this kind of visceral moment where I thought, okay, this is different, but it's similar. And then not again till I was age 20, and I had a chance to go study oceanography, and mostly I went and did this program to sail tall ships. That's the Moby Dick part, I guess. But I never, ever lived near the ocean until I moved to Connecticut in 2003, which was long after I began researching and writing about the ocean. And my perspective, I think, has prompted me to think about the ocean in ways that other historians haven't. I really pay a lot of attention to the category of play and how play teaches us about the ocean as much as work. I pay a lot more attention to how people imagine the ocean and what kind of desires or assumptions they bring with them to the ocean, in addition to things that are obviously important to historians like economic uses of the ocean and political uses of the ocean. And so in the mid-1990s, around the time I was grappling with John Stilgoe's quote, I was working on the dissertation that became the book Fathoming the Ocean, and I was asked to review an environmental exhibit whose purpose was to design, the exhibit was designed to get visitors to become activists. It was trying to get visitors to take action to protect the oceans. And this experience of writing this review of this exhibit opened my eyes to the profound effects that this widespread cultural assumption of timelessness had, and also to the dangers of leaving the humanities out of the business of articulating and solving environmental challenges. So the interactive elements of this exhibit conveyed information and arguments about the environmental crisis of the ocean as seen from the early to mid-1990s very effectively and very convincingly. Exhibit creators, though, wanted to expand the exhibit beyond science and environmentalism, so they decided to create a separate section on human interactions with the sea. And that section focused on timeless and cross-cultural connections between people and oceans. So, for example, the exhibit included memorials to fishers from 3 different cultures at 3 different times, including both industrial and traditional fisheries, and from different parts of the world. And the strategy succeeded, I thought, very well at emphasizing commonalities among disparate cultures and across time. In other words, experiences that fishers in these different communities might have had, perceptions that they might have had of the sea. But it came at the cost of erasing cultural difference and of facing historical change. And most importantly, I felt that this section worked in tension with the rest of the exhibit, which, because it emphasizes a sense of timelessness, whereas the whole purpose of the exhibit was to communicate a sense of urgency and timeliness. So I felt like they were sort of working against themselves in this way, and that maybe the exhibit would have been better off including history and maybe doing a better job in general with the humanities. The need to address environmental challenges related to the ocean, I probably don't need to tell this to anyone here, has only become more urgent since the 1990s. Newfoundlanders will remember more vividly than others the shock of the closure of the centuries-old Northwest Atlantic cod fishery, and at the time, what was considered to be the fairly inconceivable failure of the stocks to recover, as they were widely expected to by many experts, when fishing pressure was stopped for a decade. It took a really long time for a lot of very smart and dedicated scholars to study and reflect on what happened and try to understand that fishing had not simply limited the availability of a resource, it had actually changed an ecosystem. And since then, studies have confirmed overfishing and ecosystem changes around the world. Also more urgently apparent since the turn of the present century is the relationship of global climate change to the ocean. It's becoming clear the extent to which the ocean drives forces globally. Oceans and coasts also feature prominently in the expected effects from climate change. More than 90% of excess heat from global warming is absorbed by the ocean, leading to the warming of water, shifts in the range of species, the elimination of other species, sea level rise, acidification, caused when seas absorb excess CO2, and the expected and in fact beginning to be observable effects of the lack of calcium carbonate needed by some organisms to build skeletons. In late 2019, the International Panel for Climate Change released its special report on oceans and cryosphere, which concluded both that the world ocean, along with the cryosphere, has, quote, taken the heat, both literally and figuratively, for climate change, and that urgent action is needed. Recognizing the importance of the ocean for achieving sustainable development, the UN, the United Nations, has declared 2021 to 30 the decade of ocean science for sustainable development, and has published the planning report, The Science We Need for the Ocean We Want. The goals outlined in these initiatives prompted UNESCO to embrace a set of ocean literacy principles. Ocean literacy simply means understanding the ocean's influence on you and your influence on the ocean. That, according to a couple of different websites. From the perspective that values and appreciates ocean history, this definition sounds like historical perspectives and recognition of cultural differences ought to be an integral part of ocean literacy. However, history is missing from ocean literacy principles, and appreciation of cultural differences is slim at best. And a brief look at the history of how ocean literacy principles was developed helps explain why that's true. So what developed into the ocean literacy campaign emerged first from dissatisfaction among ocean scientists and marine science educators in the United States about new national science standards that were published in 1996, which included scant attention to ocean topics. They considered this to be a problem because of the importance of oceans and coasts and watersheds, and they considered it to be an opportunity because they believed that ocean-related content might spark the interest of students in science. Efforts to forge a consensus on the importance of ocean science education and to articulate and define what the content was that should be included in ocean literacy coalesced in 2002 when an educational not-for-profit called the College of Exploration hosted a conference titled Oceans for Life. Co-sponsored by the much more well-known National Geographic Society, the asynchronous online event set a tone for the impressively inclusive and collaborative culture that became the hallmark of ocean literacy, the Ocean Literacy Campaign. And by 2005, the first statement of ocean literacy principles was published. Participation in the Ocean Literacy Campaign widened beyond the US, starting in 2005 with the formation of the International Pacific Marine Science Educators Network, and came to involve marine science educators from countries in North and South America, Asia, and Europe, and also to involve other regional organizations, international organizations of marine science educators. And they worked to transform the ocean literacy from its initial American articulation into a global one. In 2013, there was an updated ocean literacy guide. You see the cover of that on your left, and the 7 ocean literacy principles listed on the right. We're going to focus on number 6, which acknowledges that oceans and humans are inexplicably interconnected. And yet, the Ocean Literacy Initiative emphasizes presentist and acultural messages about how much humans rely on the ocean and how damaging human activities have been. The content of ocean literacy reflects the interests, the expertise, the goals, and the assumptions of the people who created it, namely scientists, marine educators, and policy experts. They focus on natural science, they focus on present knowledge of the ocean, not past knowledge, and on the immediate future in terms of behavioral modification and regulations. As designed, ocean history lacks appreciation of or attention to the past or to cultural differences among groups of people around the globe and over time. On the other hand, the existence of this framework, which is grassroots and inclusive, as I mentioned before, and specifically the 6th principle, represents, I think, an invitation for historians and other humanists to contribute to the much-needed project of historicizing our human relationship with the ocean and recognizing its importance, the importance for the different relationships that different groups of people have had with the ocean. Reflecting on the first principle of ocean literacy, that there is only one world ocean and not plural oceans, provides an opportunity to illustrate what the humanities could offer ocean literacy. The emphasis on the singular ocean, it is hoped, will help ocean literate people recognize global connections and understand that despite the ocean's vast size, its resources are limited. However, this principle, asserts a timeless and static global ocean that doesn't match the lived experiences of most humans over time. Even scientists have not always viewed the ocean as a unified whole. And such overly simplistic, ahistoric understanding of the human-ocean relationship, I would argue, ultimately obstructs environmentalist goals. Here for you to take a look at are a few excellent ocean histories that are already out there. And I want to just say that we need the very best science and technology to solve our present environmental challenges that involve the ocean and even wider ones than that. And we also, I would say as a historian of science, need people to understand the importance of basing policy on science and the best scientific expertise. But I would also argue that science and technology alone will not be enough. In a recent Science magazine editorial, Jane Lubchenco and Steve Gaines insist that we need a new narrative for the ocean, and indeed, I think we do. But like the singular ocean, no one single narrative can support the changes that so many countries and so many people will have to make. So how can ocean histories help? And what I want to do here is give 3 case studies and then look at what they have in common so you can see the power and importance that ocean histories can bring to the table. Case 1. The Billion Oyster Project, a citizen science project that has the goal of restoring oysters to New York Harbor by 2035. This project engages school children, is part of a STEM initiative. It was inspired by the Oyster Recovery Project in the Chesapeake, which began in the 1990s, which had an emphasis on science, which involved very much the watermen, the people who fished for oysters, and also conservation organizations, but it also involved history. Restoration ecology got involved in asking questions about the past when they started facing the challenge of having to choose restoration goals. They had to ask, to what point in time will we try to restore the Chesapeake, in this case? And restoration ecologists got help starting in the late 1990s from an innovative partnership between historians and ecologists, the History of Marine Animal Populations, part of the Census of Marine Life. They also got help from the work of historians. This is an example of a book about the Chesapeake, from historians of science who help us understand more about the creation of knowledge about the ocean in the past and about how that knowledge was used. Case 2, the resurgence of Aboriginal whaling in communities that had historically relied on whales as important resources. In 2004, I had the opportunity, the privilege of attending a conference in Barrow, Alaska on the North Slope, and I became aware of the emerging understanding, that is emerging understanding by Western scientists, of the importance of paying attention to native knowledge about the natural world. In 1977, the International Whaling Commission had set a 0 quota for bowhead whales based on a survey of the population. Native Alaskan whaling captains thought numbers were higher, so they formed the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, did their own survey, hired scientists, and demonstrated that federal researchers had been undercounting whales based on incorrect assumptions about whale behavior and thus about where whales could be seen and therefore counted. They pushed back because bowhead whales were the most culturally significant resource to their community, who had been hunting them for thousands of years. In other words, the Inupiat and the bowhead whale have a historical relationship, which is known and communicated by elders and teachers to the younger generations. This historical relationship provides the context for present co-management of the resource. Other indigenous communities have similarly close and long-standing relationships with the ocean. The historian Joshua Reed has written a wonderful history of the Makah Nation that shows how marine space was always viewed as part of their territory, hence the title of his book, The Sea is My Country. Their relationship with the sea formed the locus of personal and group identity from the arrival of fur traders in the 18th century up to the present, when their efforts to regain control over customary fishing and whaling rights forms part of their articulation of what they call a traditional future. Case 3. In 1975, the Polynesian double-hulled voyaging canoe Hokulea was launched to initiate a project to revive voyaging and rediscover Native Hawaiians' special relationship with the ocean. Since the 1960s, some sailors had begun trying to unlock the secrets of traditional Pacific navigation by studying with expert navigators from Oceania, as well as through oral history and experimental voyaging. With help from the Micronesian navigator Mau Pialiag, the Hawaiians rediscovered knowledge of navigation and reevaluated their relationship to their island home, and also began connecting with other voyaging cultures throughout Oceania, some which still practiced traditional voyaging and others which did not. In 2017, Hokulea completed a 3-year circumnavigation that extended its program's mission from voyaging and navigational knowledge to include also an explicit environmental focus that recognized the island properties of planet Earth. So what do these projects have in common? Unlike land, people can only know the ocean indirectly. And I argue that knowledge of the oceans is mediated by the technologies and knowledge systems of people who seek and create that knowledge, whether they're fishers, navigators, or also today's modern scientists. The knowledge gained is used to exploit ocean resources, including living and non-living resources, but also resources such as connectivity. However, not all knowledge of the ocean is gained in that way. Although science and the technical knowledge of navigation is in the foreground in each of those 3 cases, attention to the past in each case was and remains important. Understanding past ecosystems and recognizing past and continuing cultural, spiritual, and economic relationships between groups of people and oceans provided the key to diagnosing problems and articulating effective solutions to both environmental and social or cultural challenges. A second thing jumps out from all 3 cases, which is that knowledge, whether about nature or history, in each case is co-produced by community members and expert specialists. In the case of knowledge about the natural world, we would use the term citizen science, but equally important is the co-production of knowledge about the past. Historians like Joshua Reed are not the authorities, they are rather the partners. This then is public history, or you could say public humanities, history by and for the people whose story it is. And third, the 3 cases have in common that they illustrate ways in which history holds the key to a better present and/or future relationship with the ocean, involving both healthier ecosystems and healthier communities. So just to say a few words by way of conclusion, humanities can help us deal with the ocean's characteristic of tracklessness. Unlike the wagon wheels of the settlers who traversed the Oregon Trail across the western United States, and I'm sure there are equivalent tracks like this in Canada, perhaps. The wake of boats is ephemeral. People cannot sense the past when they're on the ocean, except perhaps when events, perhaps like storms or spills, make visible the effects of some human actions or choices. Physical and chemical oceanographers can render the vast, trackless, and enormous ocean comprehensible by measuring temperature differences or minute amounts of particles or currents. Historians can use archival and other sources, including science, to recover activities that took place in or on oceans, activities which became invisible as soon as the fisher's net was drawn aboard or the ship's wake faded. Darwin taught us in 1859 that we are part of nature. In some languages and in the minds of many romantics and mariners, even today, the sea and ships remain feminine. This, of course, is a cultural relic. Starting in 1941 with her first book, Under the Sea Wind, Rachel Carson exercised great care to avoid anthropomorphism in her writing, an act that reminds us that the sea is not neutral. People say they love the sea, but it does not love us back. Lloyd's List, the specialist newspaper providing shipping news since 1734, irked traditionalists in 2012 when it changed its 278-year-old editorial practice. It replaced the feminine pronoun she to refer to vessels with the neutral and businesslike pronoun it. The culturally bound view of the sea and ships as feminine exists in tension with the apparently contradictory acceptance of ships as inanimate technologies subject to the forces of a dispassionate natural ocean. In reality, this apparent conflict dissolves if we accept the sea as second nature, a conflation of natural forces and human constructs. That is a human ocean. If we are mindful of geologic time, we recognize that we need the ocean more than it needs us. Indeed, it does not need us at all. Scientists predict that if humans disappear from Earth, coral reefs and most marine species would recover. The time to write and read and share ocean histories is now. The fundamental quandary of the sea's apparent timelessness makes it difficult for us to accept the unfamiliar view of the ocean as a place of dynamic change. Opacity of the ocean guarantees that we see reflected back from its surface our fears and our desires. While present issues may seem to call for scientific and technological solutions, I hope I've convinced you that there remains a central and a critical role for the humanities. Thank you.
A message requires receivers as well as emitters. And given the weather here, I want you to know my profound appreciation for all of you making Helen's message possible by coming. We have time for some questions. And Farouk and Puya, our Iranian graduate students in the Department of Sociology, have kindly offered to move around with microphones. If any of you have any remarks and questions that you'd like to bring up. Anybody? Any thoughts?
Steve Wall, and it's ex-political science. I think my question is, what do we do with ocean histories? If I reflect on mine, I've only spent perhaps 4 or 5 years of my life away from the Atlantic Ocean. Grew up swimming in it. 48 years here, very much present, aware of the destructive force, aware that all 4 grandparents crossed that ocean, I'm not sure in what conditions, to settle in the United States, and that the ocean in the US is very much a destructive force. I grew up on Long Island. The suburb where I moved to at age 11, half of it was submerged by Hurricane Sandy, not quite where our house stood, but the absurd building out beyond what were the fishing stations we used to bicycle to. I know from my brother that boardwalks on the Jersey Shore are regularly destroyed by hurricanes and rebuilt, probably because the people who have businesses there can't go elsewhere. I know from my knowledge of the frustrations of the Newfoundland history, of Newfoundland fishery, excuse me, that any agreement around the ocean, can't remember the initials, NAFO or something like that, failed miserably to prevent overfishing. I think Newfoundlanders also failed themselves, but that's less readily admitted. I also know that the institutions which made any joint action possible, those built up during and after World War II, are being very rapidly destroyed at a rate which astounds me. So what do we do with these ocean histories other than be a little bit more aware and perhaps a little bit more sad?
Well, I'll give you an example from the decisions about rebuilding after things are destroyed in storms. You know, there's a really good book by an environmental historian called Ted Steinberg called Acts of God that talks and gives very good historical background about choices, how it has more to do with choices of where people built. Anyway, he talks about the development in Florida and how there were choices to develop real estate in Florida in places that were mangrove swamps that shouldn't have ever been developed. And if you fast forward to decisions about where to rebuild after Hurricane Sandy and things like that, if you have a system that looks at economics and the rights of current landowners and local government issues and doesn't ever look at history and look at the patterns of the fact that we've rebuilt over and over again in certain places on Long Island, then we're just going to keep repeating the past. So, the challenge is figuring out how to insert that history in international, local decision-making bodies, fisheries. It's certainly complicated, but I think the learning about the ocean literacy principles was one of the things that made me realize that we have to start trying, because if we don't, then we're not going to get anywhere.
Anybody else? Any comments?
Hi, Helen.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. You flashed up the term, but didn't really engage that much with it, of the idea of the ocean as frontier, and it's a very common trope
Yes.
in terms of knowledge production about the ocean, but obviously about frontiers of accumulation in various different ways of knowledge, of resources, et cetera.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting books I read last year was Megan Black's book about the global interior, in which she talks about the U.S. Geological Survey moving out, essentially the continuity between Western dispossession and resettlement, and then the extension of that colonialism into unpeopled space, which is nominally unpeopled space,
Right.
which is the ocean, right?
Right.
So, and we have this massive, Memorial's engaged in this massive multi-university project called the Ocean Frontier Institute, which reproduces the same tropes about frontiers of knowledge and indeed about accumulation. We're in a province that is engaging in the frontier experience of ultra deep water drilling in iceberg alley type environments in the deep cold ocean. So what do you make of that? And particularly as an American historian, what do you make of this constant remobilization of the frontier metaphor of the ocean? And what do we do? What does ocean history tell us about the pitfalls of that?
Right. So the sixth chapter of my book is called Ocean Frontier, and it documents how the ocean was culturally constructed in the immediate post-World War II period as a frontier, and not just any frontier, very much a Turnerian frontier, the kind of frontier evoked by the American historian Frederick Jackson Turner to encapsulate everything you just said, the dispossession, and also the kind of endlessness, the idea that you can extract wealth, that you can ensure democracy, for certain people, that you can control nature. And so I actually think that the ocean, the cultural construction of the ocean as a frontier is one of the things that kept us from recognizing what we started noticing about land with the environmental movement. I argue in my book that it's really not until the 1990s or even the early 2000s that the people's sense of the ocean as an environment in need of protection began to be anything like what people began to realize about land, maybe even 100 years ago, but certainly, 50 years ago when the environmental movement started. And I think that metaphor of ocean frontier really had a lot to do with that. And it is incredibly distressing to see people sort of blithely continuing on. But I guess in trying to be optimistic and thinking about what the humanities can do, one of the things that that I've seen in the book I've written is how powerful in a negative way these metaphors are, but that also means maybe we look for new metaphors. Maybe that's something we can do.
I just wanted to say a word about, my background's in biology. I wanted to say a word about those places that are not being rebuilt, those places where we are taking out the defenses and letting the salt marshes rule again.
That's great. We should do more of that.
Both sides of it, right?
Yes.
Hi. You were talking about changing oceans and that, and I think it seems like what the gentleman over there said about, damages happening to shorelines and that, and kind of rebuilding this sort of boardwalk. But I guess at Newfoundland and looking north, where there's a lot of talk about like a melting Arctic, like a ice-free Northwest Passage, an ice-free Arctic. What that means, where we're not going to try to rebuild what's already lost, but using the humanities, I guess, to look forward and try to make something new. Or what does that mean in the future? Like, what will it look like, with all the changes that are going on?
So one of the things that I'm becoming increasingly aware of, having written a book that tries to do this kind of world history focus, is that one of the things that we urgently need to do is understand what's happening in our own communities, but also understand what's happening in communities around the world, and think about social justice and environmental justice, because things may not be so bad in one place, but boy, are they pretty bad in some other places. These low-lying nations in the Pacific that are already making plans for leaving their homelands. And so, to give one example, yeah, I guess that's what I would say is, we're going to have to tend to our own areas, but I think we must start thinking about the world too, other people. Brad?
Oh, hi, Helen. Brad DeYoung. I was just thinking about this issue of negative metaphors and I'm wondering about your thoughts on whether it's actually possible to reframe or reorganize those. And the analogy I'll offer is, the meaning of impressionism is, as referred to a whole style of painting, began as a very negative critique of them. They're just an impression, because it became a singular painting called an impression of a sunset, and this was impressionism, and very negatively considered. It's now anything but that. And so I guess taking words like frontiers, and there are lots of others, whether we can, rather than try to fight against them, co-opt them and reframe them and reconsider their meaning in the context of how we live today.
Right, that's interesting. I didn't know that. What we can certainly do is historicize them and understand them and call them out for what they have been in the past. And yeah, that may be a better solution than trying to think of new metaphors, because metaphors like frontier are incredibly powerful. I'm becoming more and more interested in that metaphor because I sort of want to know how science became a frontier. That's super interesting, and I think it's tied up with the power that metaphor has. So I think that's a terrific suggestion. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. What are the operative metaphors or ways of understanding the ocean for non-Western cultures?
Thank you for asking that. I'm glad you did. I'm not an expert in that, but I'm becoming more and more convinced. It seems obvious to me that one of the things we have to do is learn about the ocean from more cultures than we've been learning about the ocean from in the past, because there are lots of people who know a lot about the ocean. One of the things that just completely struck me when the 2004 tsunami came, the Moken people, who are people who live in boats around Thailand, I think, went up inland and survived. They knew that the tsunami was coming. I think there are lots of examples of people who know a lot about oceans, like the Inuit on knowing that bowhead whales live 2 human lifetimes, and that taking a long time for Western scientists to understand. And so, and I from the little bit I know about fisheries, I think fisheries is getting better at co-managing with fishers, including both fishers from Western countries and also fishers from the different cultures around the world that where fisheries management is trying to do a better job. So I guess I don't know the metaphors, but I think we ought to be talking to people who do. Yes.
Hi. Throughout your talk, if I understood you correctly, you were drawing a divide between the land and the ocean and how we study the land and the ocean. I wondered if you could speak to how some of the challenges, the pros and cons perhaps, of how to study the ocean through what type of methodologies you would adopt that distinguishes or that recognizes it as distinct from the land, what kind of language, what kind of representations.
Yeah.
I just wonder how, if it is such a distinct surface, are we equipped to study it in a distinct way that does it justice?
You know, I've back, I don't know, around 2006, I taught a graduate class on ocean history in my early years of thinking about this, and I remembered kind of asking the students, well, what do you think? Can we study ocean history the way we study land history? Are oceans different from land? And, you know, I think in some ways and then there are these kind of in-between spaces, swamps, coasts. You know, I think some of those places probably can be studied very much the way we study land as historians anyway. But I have come to feel that we probably do need to do a few things differently for oceans, and maybe it's not so surprising, you know, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, or is it the other way around? I can't remember. As a historian of science, I really am swayed by how important it is to pay attention to this question of why is knowledge pursued, how is knowledge created, how is knowledge used, by whom is the knowledge controlled. And so, you know, I feel like that kind of following the knowledge is something that is works for oceans. It also works for land, but I think there are other things that don't work for land history, that other ways of doing terrestrial history, as I call it, that wouldn't work in oceans. And so I think, you know, we have to find ways of revealing and understanding past relationships with the ocean that maybe don't exist in the same archival sources as, you know, people's diaries of going across the western prairies and writing about it and things like that. I don't know if that helps. The answer is I don't have the answer yet, but I'm hoping lots of other people will join in.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was lovely to listen to, especially when the weather is as it is outside. I'm Jennifer Lokash. I'm from the Department of English, and I'm a romanticist, so I can't resist commenting on the Byron quote that you used at the beginning. The roll on, thou deep, thou dark blue ocean roll. Which is, of course, a romantic depiction of the ocean as a sublime force. It ends with shipwrecks all over the place. One of the interesting things in that poem, though, is that a couple of stanzas later, Byron describes himself as a boy swimming in the ocean, and he's the one who's in control. So it's sort of an interesting moment that you chose the maybe the more obvious, the sublime, which is such an important aesthetic concept. So my question, that's just a comment, I couldn't help it. My question is, what role does artistic and literary representations of the ocean have in the kinds of ocean histories that you're telling or advocating for? And like, how do you use literature? I mean, I can see it's there. How do you use it in your own work?
Margaret Cohen's work on the novel and maritime literature was incredibly important for me in framing this book and thinking about different changes. I would say as a historian, I probably use literature in an incredibly flat-footed way, and other people do a much better job than me. But I do think that art and literature help get at that kind of imagination, that kind of how people identify with the ocean and create their identities from their interactions with the ocean. I think literature does a much better job. And I use literature extensively in my teaching in maritime studies because I just don't see how you could not do that. So I guess that's just an answer that says you're right.
Maybe one more question, and then I'll invite people to speak with Helen and enjoy the non-alcoholic punch in the back. But one more, yeah.
Hi, Helen. I'm Lisa Moore. Thank you for that talk. It was wonderful. I'm wondering if you had a chance to see a beautiful work of art by Will Gill that's photographed. It's a chair, and it was a chair designed to look like the kind of chair that could be found in Outport, Newfoundland. Wooden chairs that were all painted the same shade of green, because I think there must have been a sale on that color. But his chair was actually was not wooden. It was made of metal, and it was attached to a piece of rock at the very edge of the ocean. And he documented the waves coming in over the chair and freezing onto the chair and destroying the chair eventually. And people became very attached to that chair because I think it was an incredible metaphor for exactly what you're talking about, the connection between people and the ocean. And when I look at those photographs, I think of, as Jennifer was talking about, the sublime and the unknowability of the sublime. And often when we think about the sublime, we think about height. But I know that you've written about depth and how to discover depth in the ocean, or the discovery of depth. And that, in fact, it was not that unknowable, but that people have been searching for that and using all kinds of ingenious ways of finding it. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't seen that piece of art, but I would love to. I'll just give you one example from one of the books I showed of ocean histories. There's a historian named Kevin Dawson who's done incredible work on enslaved swimmers. And he's discovered that West African cultures, perhaps no surprise, were many of these cultures had members who were very adept swimmers, taught their children to swim, but also got very involved in diving. And they dived for all kinds of reasons, to clear out debris from a river that was in the way of other uses of the river, and fishing and things like that. But when these people were enslaved, they were often employed to dive. In other words, their skill was recognized to do diving for a whole range of reasons, like they had originally learned to dive in West Africa, but also other reasons to earn money for their employers or for themselves. And so it's just a realization that there are many, 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 many cultures out there who have in the past had a very profound engagement with the underwater. That engagement is economic, but it's also very tied with their identities. These people tended to be respected for their diving skills. I think we're more familiar with examples like the Ama pearl divers and things like that, but diving is, in fact, just a week or so ago, we learned that Neanderthals dived for food and had swimmer's ear a lot. We learned that a few months ago. So if you have a mania like I do and you pay attention to anything that has to do with the undersea, you begin to see a world where lots of people have relationships with the undersea that are profound and meaningful and just kind of unfamiliar to us. So I don't know if that exactly answers you, but that's what pops into my mind.